Well, g'day and welcome to the Northern Illawarra Uniting Church sermon for this week, March 24th. Today we come to Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week, when Jesus enters Jerusalem and begins the final week before his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and resurrection. And so that means that today we're going to jump out of the flow of the story that we've been reading through the beginning of Mark and jumping into Mark 11 just for this week to read about this remarkable moment towards the end of Jesus' ministry. And this is such a vivid and peculiar passage. In the Gospel of Mark so far, we have met Jesus as a teacher, as an exorcist, we have met Jesus as a healer. But today in the reading, we encounter Jesus taking actions that are so strange. We can't call them teachings or healings or exorcisms. They're more like performances, 3 pieces of performance. That's what we're looking at today. So as I read the passage today, and it's a longer one, verses 1 through 22 in chapter 11, I'm going to stop every once in a while and just check in where we are. So let me read it for us, and then we'll make some reflections on this truly remarkable passage. Let's start in Mark chapter 11, starting in verse 1. When they, that is Jesus and the disciples, were approaching Jerusalem, at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. And if anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it and will send it back here immediately.'" Well, they went away and they found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. And as they were untying it, some of the bystanders says, "What are you doing untying the colt?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Well, let's stop there for a second. This first performance of Jesus is his entry into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, or a colt here as it said, a donkey that has been taken without asking permission. And when people naturally ask what the disciples are doing, this donkey hijacking, they're simply told to say, "The Master, the Lord, has need of it." So Jesus is commandeering a donkey. And what comes next is even stranger. Verse 8. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches they had cut from the fields. And when those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." And then he entered into Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So Jesus rides into town with this donkey and accepts the praises of the people with palm branches, leafy branches waved. It's like a great victory march for a conquering general, but he's on a donkey and then he just leaves the city. So there's this second part, and then we come to perhaps the strangest passage, a passage that people for generations have struggled with. Jesus finds a fig tree, but as he looks at the fig tree, when he's hungry, he finds only leaves and not fruit. Let's read the story. Verse 12. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard it. Okay, weird story. We'll come back to that. But then finally, Jesus does the most controversial thing he could do in his day. He goes into the temple and causes a ruckus. Verse 15. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began driving out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." When the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill Jesus, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. Controversial. Jesus goes to the temple, throws the money changers out of the temple. He causes a huge ruckus and says this is supposed to be a house of prayer, not a place for money changers. People get angry, they want to kill him, and Jesus again just leaves the city. The second great performance. And the story finishes by bringing us back to the fig tree. In the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. And Jesus said to them, have faith in God. Friends, what is going on in these stories? Hijacking donkeys, play acting at a Roman victory march, property damage at the temple, cursing fig trees. What is Jesus doing in these stories? With all these strange performances, when people, for many people, these stories are just, they don't know what to do with them. When they see Jesus cursing a fig tree, we get uncomfortable. Is Jesus crazy? Why is Jesus doing all these crazy actions? Well, let's talk for a minute about performance and art. When was the last time a piece of art, in particular a painting, made the news? Well, honestly, the time that paintings actually make the news these days is for one very specific reason: when paintings sell for a lot of money. I remember a few years ago, there was a painting by Leonardo da Vinci called Salvator Mundi, one of the oldest pictures of Christ painted by Leonardo da Vinci, and it sold for, I think, $90 million. And this makes the news because the story that our world loves to tell is the story of money, especially lots of money, the mega rich, large amounts of money. These things just dominate our imagination. And so when we think about art in the popular imagination, often it's just, wow, that's expensive. But there's one exception that I can think of, a story about art that really wasn't about money, although it kind of was, but it was the subversion of that idea. In October of 2018, a framed print of a spray-painted canvas from 2006 by the artist Banksy called Girl with a Balloon was put up for sale in the last lot of Sotheby's auction house in London. Girl with the Balloon's a beautiful image. It's a print of a girl reaching up towards a red heart-shaped balloon. This is on sale, pretty standard stuff, and the print sold to a bidder on the telephone for $1.4 million. A high price, but not crazy for Sotheby's. But this Girl with the Balloon was not the artwork. See, what happened, the moment that the hammer on this auction went down and the art was sold, the work of art, the girl with the balloon, mounted and framed on the wall in this beautiful gold frame, the moment the hammer came down, the art started to lower itself through a shredder built into the bottom of the frame. The audience who was sitting there gasped as the painting, the print emerged below the frame in strips. The picture was ruined, destroyed, stripped into pieces. And in that moment, it created an entirely new artwork. Sotheby's declared that they had been Banksy'd, and with this brilliant action, Banksy got us talking about art and money in a new way. Not just, wow, that painting was expensive, but wow, what happens when art is destroyed by that? Girl with the Balloon became a new artwork called Love is in the Bin. And this was more than art. It was a performance that challenged the very story of art. While people were in the midst of telling the old story, Banksy was telling a new story. And this example from 2018 is closer to what Jesus is doing than what we might traditionally think of as a sermon or a teaching or an action. Jesus does something in public that provokes a reaction. These are performances that cause people to wonder and question and evaluate. The story that they've been telling themselves has been interrupted by a new story that breaks in. It causes them and us to evaluate not just the story, but ourselves. Jesus' actions, his performances open up new stories that bump us out of the rut of all our old stories. Listen, I know this. The question that most often comes up during a sermon is, when is lunch? But these performances punch through the imagination and create a new story, a new question. What is going on? Now, this is not beginning with Jesus. Throughout the Bible, this is the work of prophets. Prophets are not here to tell the future. Prophets are here to remind us with compelling intensity that things ain't necessarily so. That the stories that we've got ourselves wrapped up in are not necessarily the same as the story that God has been telling and God is telling still. That we can have a new imagination. We can start to reconnect with these old stories and tell them anew, these stories that God is telling. And today we need this prophetic word more than ever. We are practical people who live in a practical place and a practical time. We are very good at implementing things and following the script that we've been given and following that script better and better. We can operate well in the story that we are given. But how good are we at imagining new stories, new things? Stories of justice and peace, holiness, and wholeness, not just for the elite or the wealthy, but for the least of these. It's this kind of new imagination, these new stories that shake us out of our old stories. And this is what we need prophets for. And this is what Jesus came to do with these performances. He came to resuscitate our imaginations with radical actions. He's not come to soothe us in our self-satisfied reveries, but to stir us up to remember all the goodness we have forgotten, to puncture the old stories that we have been perfecting, to shred them like Banksy shred the painting, and lift up the old stories that we had forgotten about, that life is meant to shock us, reconnect us to what truly matters. So let's look at what Jesus does, and just as we finish the sermon, let's see what these provocative actions are and maybe see if we can understand the meaning, the story that Jesus is trying to tell. This is kind of artsy, so let's put our art critic hats on and see what Jesus is doing with these performances. Firstly, Jesus rides into town on a donkey. Now, I think that's an easy one. Everybody in Jesus' day was waiting for a king. And everybody knew what the story of a king was. That story had been told by Babylon and Rome and the Greeks so many times. And all these kings would ride into a conquered city, leading captives in a procession and riding on a white horse as a display of military might. So Jesus takes this image of riding into the city as a military conqueror. Yes, he's a king, but he's riding a donkey. And I love the way the story begins, is that it emphasizes the fact that Jesus is a king. He commandeers a donkey. The master has need of it, we're told. There's something hilarious about this. The Lord commands you to give him a donkey. It's like the King of England coming up to your 2008 Toyota Yaris and saying in a great noble voice, "Let me use thy 2008 Toyota Yaris. Your Lord has need of it." It's weird, it's a surprising connection, but it emphasizes the fact that Jesus is a king, but he is not the kings that you recognize. Jesus is a king, all right, but he's no self-serious, domineering military dictator ruling by force. He's a king who comes humbly, riding on a donkey, praised by children. In this action, the story of what it means to be king is being rewritten. And Jesus is reshaping their imaginations. Maybe we need to tell new stories. What visions of authority do we need to see retooled? How is our vision of leadership, even here in the church, determined by the kings of the world? And how might it be shaped by this, Jesus, the King of Kings? So that's the donkey, the first performance. Now we have to wrestle with the weirdest, the hardest part of this story. We're going to talk about the fig tree. And Jesus cursing the fig tree for not bearing figs. And let's be honest, it's a strange story. The comedian Louis C.K. actually has a whole bit on this. He reads this passage out and says, what are we supposed to do with cranky, hungry Jesus? But stick with me because this is powerful stuff. Jesus sees the fig tree because he sees leaves. He sees it off in the distance. He sees the leaves waving. It's the leaves that draw him in. But when he gets to the tree and pulls apart the leaves, he finds no fruit. In fact, he should not have expected any fruit. It wasn't the season for figs. But the truth remains, it's leaves without fruit. So Jesus condemns the tree. It's a strong action, but what does it mean? Well, think back to this story, this moment that we just read about. Where else have we heard about leaves in this story? Well, that's right. the palm leaves that everybody is waving as he walks into the city. If you ever go to church on Palm Sunday, we're going to do it at Sunday at church this week. People wave their palm leaves in the air. It's a great moment of celebration, a great moment of praise. When Jesus enters the city, everyone is waving palm branches, praising God and worshiping. Their words are full of praise and honor. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. It's a great show. There's plenty of leaves. But where's the fruit? What good is a fig tree that doesn't bear fruit on its leaves? And the fig tree is supposed to bear figs, but what fruit are the people of God supposed to bear? Jesus is shaking up that story as well. And Jesus is not quite done because he has this last performance to give. Because Jesus goes straight from here, he goes home, and then the next day he comes to the temple right in the heart of the city. The temple was the heart of Israel's fruitfulness, the place where people were supposed to worship. In fact, the place where people of the world were supposed to come and be welcomed by the people of God. The temple was supposed to be this sign of God's impact, not just on the Jews, but on the whole world. It was to be a sign of Israel's fruitfulness. But what does Jesus find? He sees people using the outer parts of the temple, the parts that were specifically set aside to be used by Gentiles and outsiders, the place where new fruit was supposed to grow. He sees it being used as a place to buy and sell temple supplies. The house of prayer had become a marketplace, and instead of being fruitful, the people of God had settled for being profitable. Ancient historians like Josephus tell us that over the top of the temple, just over the door, in Jesus' time, there was a giant carving of a vine with grape vines hanging from over it, covered in gold, placed above the door and winding around the pillars. The temple was supposed to be a place of fruitfulness. When Jesus tosses out the tables of the money changers, he's calling the people back to an old story. They had chosen profits, money, possessions, control. But Jesus reminds them of the old story that they are supposed to be wildly fruitful. The people were busy, no doubt. They were doing God business as they saw it. But how much of it was leaves and how much of it was fruit? A bunch of actions that kept the temple business running with business and activity, but where was the prayer? Where was the hospitality to the outsider coming to worship? They were expecting a king to come, but were they expecting just a king like every other king so that their empire could just trump the other empire? They were expecting that singing hosannas was the same thing as really encountering God. But were they really ready to receive God when he showed up? The church today can be just as wrapped up in the stories of the world. We focus on money and resources and busyness, activity and words. But Jesus keeps jolting us out of those stories and leading us to the deeper ones, to rediscover generosity and hospitality, hope, love, resurrection, holiness in the midst of the world. These things are not productive. These things are stranger. But to get us there, Jesus doesn't lecture us. He doesn't moralize to us. He doesn't condemn us. He's seeking to free us, break us out of these old habits, these old stories, the old expectations of the world, and remind us of the even older stories of grace and spiritual power and love and resurrection. Friends, next week, in the coming week, Jesus has one more performance to give. He will go to a cross and expose the power of death as one more old story that we submit to. And he will tell a story that we had forgotten, a story that began at the very beginning of creation, that love is more powerful than the grave. So as this Easter comes, may we pay attention to that deeper, older story, and may it shake us out of the stories we find ourselves trapped in. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.